When I pulled into my daughter's driveway that Tuesday morning and saw her standing at the kitchen window with her shoulders caved in like that, I knew something was deeply wrong. Not the ordinary kind of wrong. Not the "I had a bad week" kind of wrong. The kind of wrong that settles into your bones and stays there. I had driven 3 hours from Savannah to surprise her. It was supposed to be a happy visit. I had her favorite peach preserves in a paper bag on the passenger seat, the ones from the little roadside stand off I-16 that she's been asking me to bring since last Christmas. I was looking forward to sitting on her back porch with coffee and watching the morning light come across the yard. Instead, I sat in my car for a full minute just watching her through that window. My daughter, my Rebecca, who turns 41 this spring, was standing at the kitchen sink scrubbing something, her hair pulled back in a way she only wears it when she hasn't had time to think about herself. And behind her, visible even through the glass, I could see shapes moving. People on her sofa, a man with his feet up on her coffee table, children running through the hallway without anyone telling them to slow down. I got out of the car. I want to give you a little context before I tell you what happened next, because none of this makes sense without it. 3 years ago, my daughter went through a divorce that almost broke her in half. 18 years with a man who never once raised a hand to her, but found 100 other ways to grind her down. He told her she was too sensitive, too needy, too much. When she finally filed the papers, he took the house they'd built together in Macon, cleaned out their joint savings account, and kept the car I'd signed over to her for her 38th birthday. Rebecca showed up at my door in Savannah with 2 bags and a look in her eyes I'd never seen before. Hollow, like the lights were on, but nobody was home. For almost 8 months she lived with me. I watched her rebuild herself from nothing. She started going on walks again. She started cooking again. She laughed at something on television one night and then looked startled by the sound of her own laugh, like she'd forgotten she could do that. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a bookkeeper for a regional insurance company before I retired. I am not a woman of means, but I am a woman of means at discipline. And over those 32 years, I had quietly set aside $61,000. It was my cushion, my don't be a burden to anyone money. When Rebecca was ready to start over, I used most of it. I found a townhouse in a small community outside of Augusta. 2 bedrooms, a little fenced yard, a kitchen with a bay window that looks out over a magnolia tree. It cost $58,000. I put it entirely in her name. I sat across from the closing attorney, and I made sure of one thing: Rebecca's name only. Not mine, not anyone else's, hers alone. A woman needs to have something that is completely hers, something the world cannot reach in and take away. I learned that the hard way in my own life, and I was not going to let my daughter learn it the same way. The day I handed her those keys, she stood in the middle of that empty living room and cried until she had nothing left. Happy tears, relief tears, the kind of crying that comes from being held up by something solid after a very long fall. That was 14 months ago. 8 months after she moved in, she met a man at a hardware store of all places. His name was Mitchell. He was buying weatherproofing tape. She was buying shelf brackets. He held the door for her and then stood there making her laugh in the parking lot for 20 minutes. She called me that evening sounding lighter than she had in years. I want to be clear, I liked Mitchell at first. He was attentive. He remembered things she told him. He brought her coffee the way she liked it, without being asked. When he proposed 6 months after they met, fast as that was, I told myself that sometimes people just know that love doesn't follow a schedule. What I didn't know, what Rebecca didn't know until it was too late to see clearly, was that Mitchell and his family operated as a unit, not in the warm, close-knit way. In the way of a system where resources flow in one direction and everyone knows whose job it is to provide them. Standing on Rebecca's front walk that Tuesday morning, I was about to find out exactly how that system worked. I knocked. No one answered. I knocked again. One of the children, a boy, maybe 7 or 8, came to the door, looked at me, and ran back inside, shouting something I couldn't make out. I let myself in. The smell hit me first. Not dirty, exactly, but heavy, the smell of too many people in a space that wasn't built for them. Coffee and bacon grease and something sweet that had been spilled somewhere and not entirely cleaned up. The living room was strewn with bags, shoes, a travel pillow, 3 or 4 phone chargers snaking across the floor. My coffee table, the little farmhouse one I'd helped Rebecca find at an estate sale, had a ring on it from someone's cup. My daughter was at the sink. She had rubber gloves on, the kind you use when you've been doing dishes for a long time. When she turned and saw me, something crossed her face that I can only describe as shame mixed with relief, which is one of the worst combinations I have ever seen on a person I love. "Mom," she said. Just that, like the word cost her something. "Becky." I looked past her at the stack of dishes, at the full counter, at the skillet with dried eggs still on it sitting on the stove. "What's going on?" Before she could answer, a woman came out of the hallway with the confident walk of someone who has decided they belong wherever they happen to be standing. Mitchell's older sister. Her name was Tamara. I had met her once at the wedding, briefly, at the reception. She had given me a hug that was too tight and talked about herself for 6 minutes without asking me a single question. "Oh, you must be Rebecca's mom," she said, like I was a guest who had arrived unexpectedly at her party. "We were wondering when you'd come around." I looked at her steadily. "This is my daughter's house. I come when I need to." She smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes. "Of course. Can I get you some coffee?" "Well," she glanced at Rebecca. "Becca, can you make your mother some coffee?" I watched my daughter start to turn toward the coffee maker automatically, the way you move when you've been moving that way for a while without thinking about it, and I said, "Leave it," quietly. But she stopped. "Why don't you and I step outside?" I said to Rebecca. "She's got dishes to finish," Tamara said pleasantly. "We're about to start lunch prep, actually. It takes a while with this many people." I counted, doing a slow look around the room. Tamara. Another woman I didn't know sitting on the sofa looking at her phone. I'd find out later that was Mitchell's cousin Renata, a name I hadn't heard before that day. 2 children. A man asleep in the recliner I had given Rebecca from my own living room, whom I eventually learned was Tamara's husband Dale. And from somewhere down the hall, voices, at least 2 more. "How many people are staying here?" I asked. "Oh, it's just family," Tamara said easily. "Mitchell said we were welcome for the summer. It's so nice to have a yard for the kids." The summer. I repeated that in my head, slowly. "Come on," I said to Rebecca, and I took her by the elbow and walked her to the back porch. She didn't say anything until I closed the sliding door behind us. Then she sat down on the step and put her face in her hands. I sat beside her. I have bad knees, and it took me a moment, but I sat beside her on that step and I waited. "It's been 3 weeks," she said without looking up. "Tell me." She told me. It came out in pieces, the way things do when you've been holding them together by sheer force of will, and someone finally gives you permission to put them down. Tamara had called Mitchell 5 weeks ago saying she was between apartments and needed somewhere to land for a few weeks. Mitchell said yes without talking to Rebecca first, and when Rebecca brought it up, carefully, because she'd learned to say things carefully. He told her family was family, and it would only be a short time. Then Tamara arrived with Dale and their 2 kids, and 3 days later, Mitchell's cousin Renata showed up with a bag saying she needed to clear her head after a breakup. Then Mitchell's college friend Craig arrived. He and Mitchell had known each other since freshman year, and Craig had apparently been going through something with his job and needed a place. All of it presented as temporary, all of it bleeding into the next thing. "Where are you sleeping?" I asked. She finally looked at me. "Mitchell and I are in our room," she said, "but Tamara said the pullout in the guest room hurts her back. So we moved Craig to the guest room, and Tamara took the—" She stopped. "Tamara took what?" "She's been using my office." Rebecca's voice dropped. "I was using it to do freelance work in the evenings. I've been doing medical transcription on the side since March, trying to save up a little. She just moved in there one day and set up her stuff. Said it was the only room with good light." I sat very still. I am not a woman who yells. I never have been. But I felt something settle into me in that moment that was cold and quiet and extremely determined. "And the bills," I said. It wasn't a question. She pressed her lips together. "The groceries. I've done 3 big runs in 3 weeks. Mitchell said his account is a little tight because of the layoff." "What layoff?" "He was laid off last month from the logistics company. He's looking for something, but—" She shook her head. "He said we'd be fine, that unemployment would cover it. But the grocery bill last week alone was $340, and I'm the one keeping the utilities on. $340 on groceries. $340 of my daughter's money feeding people who had walked into her home and set up camp as if the hospitality was a given, as if she were a service and not a human being with limits and a savings account that wasn't unlimited." "And what does Mitchell say when you bring this up?" She was quiet for a moment. "He says I'm being hostile to his family, that if I really loved him I'd understand that his people are going through hard times. He said—" She stopped. "What did he say?" She looked at me with those eyes that looked so much like mine, and she said, "He told me that I should be grateful, that I was alone before him, that nobody else was going to take on a divorced woman my age and not mind about her past." Something moved through me that I don't have a clean word for. I stood up. "Come inside with me," I said. The kitchen was busier when we came back in. Tamara was now at my daughter's stove, heating something in a pot. The cousin Renata had moved to a kitchen stool. The children were fighting over something near the back hallway. Dale was still asleep in the recliner. I stood in the entrance to the living room. "I need everyone's attention," I said, not loudly. But there is a certain register of voice that a 67-year-old woman who raised a child alone and balanced other people's books for 3 decades can achieve. And I achieved it. People stopped. Tamara turned from the stove. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," I said. "Quite a few things, actually." I looked around the room deliberately. "This home belongs to my daughter. Her name alone is on the deed. I purchased it for her 14 months ago, and I made very certain of the legal arrangement when I did. Mitchell has no ownership interest in this property, which means that his ability to invite guests here is limited to what Rebecca agrees to. And I'd like to know, has anyone actually asked Rebecca if she was comfortable with this arrangement?" The room was quiet. "I thought so," I said. Tamara put down her spoon. She had the practiced expression of someone who manages conflict through warmth, weaponized as condescension. "Well, we're family," she said. "I don't think family needs a formal invitation. We're not strangers." "You are in her home without her permission," I said simply. "Whether you're family or not, that's what you are. Mitchell invited us." Mitchell, I said, does not own this house. My daughter does. I heard the front door open behind me. Mitchell came in. He'd been out, I found out later, picking up more coffee because they'd run out, the coffee my daughter buys, and he stopped when he read the room. He was a decent-looking man, 43, with an easy-going way about him that I had once found reassuring and now understood was partly an expression of someone who had never had to face a consequence he couldn't charm his way out of. He looked at me. He looked at Rebecca. Something in his face shifted. "Alice," he said. "Alice, my name." He was trying to stay on familiar ground. "I didn't know you were coming." "I came to see my daughter," I said, "who has been sleeping on the edge of her own life for 3 weeks while your family uses her house and her money and her time. Now, I'd like to ask you something directly, Mitchell, and I'd like a direct answer." He nodded slowly. "Did you tell Tamara she could have Rebecca's workspace?" A pause. "She needed somewhere to be during the day. It's just temporary." "Rebecca uses that room for work that earns her income. You knew that. It's not like she couldn't work somewhere else in the—" "Did you tell her that she should be grateful to you?" I asked. "Because of her age? Because of her divorce?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. It had weight. Rebecca made a small sound behind me. Mitchell's jaw tightened. "That came out wrong," he said. "I'd like to know how it was supposed to come out." He didn't answer. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. "I'm going to call my attorney," I said to the room, to all of them. "His name is Harold Pierce, and he handled the closing on this property. I want to put this on speaker so there's no confusion later about what the law says." I dialed. Harold picked up on the second ring. Harold has been handling property matters for families in the Savannah area for 30 years, and when I explained what I needed, he was clear and unhesitating. Yes, the property was solely in Rebecca's name. Yes, as a premarital private asset, it remained hers under Georgia law regardless of marriage. Yes, she had the legal right to ask anyone to leave her property, and if they refused, she could contact law enforcement. It would be considered trespassing. The relationship to her husband was irrelevant. I thanked Harold and hung up. "You have 2 hours to gather your things," I said to Tamara. "To the room. I want this done calmly and without incident, but I need you to understand that this is not negotiable." Tamara stared at me. "You can't be serious." "I am entirely serious." "Mitchell," she turned to her brother, "are you going to let her do this? This is your wife's mother. She doesn't have any authority here. You live here." This was the moment. I knew it, and I think Rebecca knew it, and I think somewhere under all his easy charm, Mitchell knew it too. He looked at his sister for a long moment. Then he looked at my daughter, standing by the kitchen entrance with her hands still slightly red from the rubber gloves, her shoulders, that look on her face, and I watched something shift in him. "She's right," he said quietly. Tamara's face changed. "Excuse me." "She's right, Tamara. Rebecca didn't agree to this. I told you to come without asking her. I should have asked her." He looked at the floor, then back up. "I've been letting all of you settle in here like it was my house to offer, and it's not. It's hers. And she's been running herself ragged, taking care of everyone, and I've been telling her she was the problem." His voice cracked slightly on that last word. Tamara opened her mouth. He shook his head. "No, I mean it. Start packing." The next 2 hours were not quiet. Tamara made her displeasure known at considerable volume. Renata didn't say much, but moved through the house with tight, pointed efficiency, making sure every closet she opened was opened a little too hard. Craig was actually gracious about it. He came and found me in the kitchen and said quietly, "I figured this was coming. I'm sorry I overstayed, which I appreciated. Dale slept through most of it and only became aware of the situation when Tamara woke him up to carry the suitcases. At one point, Tamara came and stood in front of me with her arms crossed. "You know you're destroying your daughter's marriage," she said. "He's going to resent her for this." "If he resents her for wanting to live with dignity in her own home," I said, "then the problem was never going to be fixed with more time." She stared at me for a long moment, then she walked away. Before she left, she turned to Rebecca one last time. "I hope you know what you chose today," she said with the gravity of someone handing down a sentence. "Family forgives, but family also remembers." Rebecca, to my great pride, looked at her evenly and said, "Then I hope your memory serves you well, Tamara, because what I'll remember is that I asked for help and what I got was used." That was my daughter talking, not me, her. I stood very still in that moment and felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for a long time. They left. 4 vehicles pulling out of the cul-de-sac one after another while the neighbors pretended not to watch from their yards. When the last car turned the corner, it was just the 3 of us, Rebecca, Mitchell, and me, standing in a house that needed to be aired out and cleaned and made to feel like hers again. Mitchell sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. After a minute he said, "Alice, I owe you an apology." "You owe Rebecca the apology." He nodded. He looked at my daughter. "I said things to you that I have no excuse for, about your age, about being grateful." He stopped. "That was cruel, and it was wrong, and I don't know why I said it except that I was scared, and when I get scared, I say things that I shouldn't." Rebecca stood with her arms wrapped around herself. "You said it because you've said versions of it before," she told him. "Not that loud, but you've said it." He flinched. "I know." "I need you to understand something," she said, and her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in years. "This house is mine. My mother worked for 30 years, and she gave it to me, and it is the first thing in my adult life that belongs to me and no one else. I don't care if I'm 41. I don't care that I was married before. This is my home, and I am not a placeholder, and I am not lucky to have someone willing to put up with me. I am a person, and I deserve to be treated like one." Mitchell was crying before she finished, not performance crying. The real kind that men do when they've finally heard something they've been successfully avoiding hearing for too long. I gave them the room. I went and sat on the back porch with the peach preserves I'd brought and a spoon I'd found in the drawer because I hadn't eaten since 5 in the morning and I needed a moment. The magnolia tree in the corner of the yard was in bloom. There was a robin working on something in the grass near the fence. It was a perfectly normal afternoon in Augusta, Georgia, and I was 67 years old and I was tired, but I was not sorry. That night, I stayed in Rebecca's guest room, the actual guest room, with clean sheets. Before I went to sleep, my daughter knocked and came and sat on the edge of the bed the way she used to when she was young and needed to talk. "Do you think I'm going to lose him?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think that's the wrong question." She thought about that. What's the right question? The right question is whether the version of him that stays is one you can trust. Whether he can look at what happened these past 3 weeks and be honest with himself about his role in it, not just apologize once and go back to normal. Actually change. She was quiet for a long time. "He has a lot of conditioning," she finally said. "His mother always. It was always her way. She passed it down to all of them. That the family comes first. That the women in the family take care of things. That a wife's job is to accommodate." "That's an explanation," I said. It's not an excuse. He's a grown man. I know. She pulled at a thread on the comforter. He's going to have to figure out what he wants to be. Yes, I said, and you don't have to wait for him to figure it out on your timetable. She hugged me then, there on the edge of the bed, and I held her like she was small again, like she was 5 years old, and the world was manageable. She's not small, and the world isn't manageable, but some moments don't care about that. In the weeks that followed, Mitchell did something I hadn't expected. He kept his word. He found a therapist and went twice a week without Rebecca asking him to continue. He talked to Rebecca about what the therapist was calling enmeshment, that word again, and how he had spent his entire life believing that taking care of his family of origin was the definition of being a good person, which made it nearly impossible for him to see when that belief was being used to take advantage of him and of her. Tamara called 6 times in the first 2 weeks. Mitchell answered once. He told her calmly that he was not going to discuss what had happened until she was willing to acknowledge how Rebecca had been treated. Tamara hung up. Then she sent 3 texts to Rebecca directly, which Mitchell didn't know about until Rebecca showed them to him. He called his sister back and told her that any further contact with his wife needed to go through him first, and that if she sent Rebecca another guilt-laced message, they would take a break from all communication for a while. The texts stopped. 5 weeks after that Tuesday morning, I drove back to Augusta. This time I called ahead. This time Rebecca answered on the second ring and told me to come for dinner on Saturday, that she was trying a new pot roast recipe and she wanted me to tell her if she got the herbs right. When I arrived, the house felt different. Not just cleaner, though it was that. It felt like it exhaled when I walked in. Rebecca's desk was back in her office, her transcription equipment set up neatly. A little plant on the windowsill that hadn't been there before. There were fresh flowers on the table. Mitchell was in the kitchen with her, not watching, not in the way, just present, handing her things when she reached for them, asking her questions about her work, listening to the answers. I sat at that kitchen table and I watched my daughter move through her own home like it was hers, like she had never once had to question whether it was, and something settled in me that I realized had been unsettled for a very long time. We ate pot roast and talked about her plans. She was thinking about expanding the transcription work, maybe picking up a specialty certification. She looked into the costs. She had a plan written out. Mitchell said he'd been talking to a recruiter, that there was a logistics coordinator position opening in the fall with a firm in Columbia, solid benefits, closer to what he'd made before. They talked about it like partners, like 2 people who were actually in the same room together. After dinner, Mitchell cleared the table and Rebecca walked me to my car. The evening was warm. The fireflies had just started coming out in the yard. "Are you happy?" I asked her. I needed to hear it from her, not just see it. She thought about it, which I appreciated. She didn't just say yes. "I'm getting there," she said. "I feel like myself again, and I haven't felt like myself in a very long time." I nodded. "Mom." She held my hand with both of hers. "I need to tell you something. When Tamara said what she said, that you were destroying my marriage, I was scared for a second. I felt that old pull, the one that says, keep the peace, be agreeable, don't make things worse." "I know," I said. "But then I thought about what you did. You spent everything you'd saved. You did it so I'd have a place that was mine. And I let them treat it like it was anyone's. I let them treat me like I was anyone's." She shook her head. "I'm not going to do that again." I squeezed her hands. "You know what's funny," she said. "The whole time they were packing, I kept waiting to feel guilty. And I didn't. I felt I felt like I was watching something that should have happened sooner. That's not guilt, I said. That's clarity. She laughed, a real one, the kind I'd been waiting to hear since before all of this started. I drove home to Savannah that night with the windows down, the warm Georgia air coming in. I had most of my pension left and my little apartment on Jones Street and the occasional freelance bookkeeping I still pick up to keep busy. I don't have a lot, but I have enough. I thought about all the women I had known in my life who had stayed too long in rooms that were shrinking around them because they believed leaving would cost more than staying. I thought about my own years, the decisions I'd made and the ones I'd waited too long to make. I thought about my daughter, who was finally sleeping in her own bedroom in her own home with the right person beside her, and the front door locked against anyone who hadn't been invited. A home is not just walls. It's not just a deed with a name on it, though that matters too. And don't let anyone tell you it doesn't. A home is the place where you are allowed to exist without permission, where you don't have to apologize for taking up space, where you wake up in the morning and the day belongs to you. I gave that to my daughter once, in the form of a closing document and a set of keys. She had to learn to keep it for herself. I think she finally has. I've thought a lot about that Tuesday morning since it happened. Not about the confrontation itself. That part was actually the simplest thing I did all day. What I keep coming back to is the moment just before I knocked on that door, sitting in my car, watching my daughter through the kitchen window, her shoulders, the way she was moving, and knowing, before a single word had been spoken, that something had gone very wrong in a place I had tried so hard to make safe. What happened to Rebecca didn't happen because she was weak. I want to be clear about that because I've heard people say things like that about women in her situation, that they should have spoken up sooner, that they let it happen. But what I watched my daughter carry for those 3 weeks wasn't weakness. It was the result of years of being told in her first marriage and then quietly in her second that her comfort was less important than everyone else's peace. That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when someone has been worn down long enough that they stop trusting their own instincts. The cruelty of it is that it looks like compliance from the outside. What Tamara and Mitchell's family did wasn't just rude houseguest behavior. It was a calculated use of goodwill, taking the warmth Rebecca extended and treating it as a resource to be drawn from until it ran dry. They didn't ask if she was okay. They didn't notice the rubber gloves, the cleared-out pantry, the room she'd lost, or they noticed and decided it wasn't their problem. That's a choice, and choices like that have a way of catching up. Mitchell catching up to himself. That's the part I didn't expect. I've known men who could look directly at what they'd done and still find a way to make it someone else's fault. Mitchell wasn't that man, or at least he chose not to be that man in the moment it counted. He looked at his sister, then at his wife, and he said, "She's right. That took something. It doesn't excuse the 3 weeks, but it mattered." What I've come to believe after 67 years and a divorce of my own and watching my daughter rebuild herself twice is that how we treat the people we love when it's inconvenient. That's the real measure. Not the grand gestures, the small daily decisions. Do I speak up or stay quiet? Do I protect her or protect my own comfort? Do I tell the truth or tell the easier thing? Rebecca telling Tamara, "What I'll remember is that I asked for help, and what I got was used." I didn't coach her to say that. That came from her, from something she'd been building back in herself quietly for 14 months in that little house with the magnolia tree in the yard. That's what happens when you give a person solid ground and enough time. Eventually, they remember who they are. I'm Robert, 67 year. I'm a retired bookkeeper from Savannah who saved her money and made one good decision with it. But I know this. The choices that shape a life aren't usually dramatic. They're the small ones, made when nobody's watching, whether to tell the truth, whether to hold a line, whether to show up for someone even when it's inconvenient and 3 hours away and you didn't plan for it that morning. Rebecca showed up for herself that day in her kitchen. I like to think I showed up for her. And Mitchell eventually showed up too. That's enough. That's actually quite a lot.